There's a psychological phenomenon that happens inside certain people, and most of the world never sees it coming. A person who has spent years absorbing your pain, forgiving your mistakes, and protecting your emotional world quietly vanishes. Not out of weakness, not out of anger. They vanish because something inside them finally decided, enough. And here's what nobody tells you. That moment is not emotional. It's calculated. It's cold. And it is completely irreversible. You've probably seen it before. Someone who seemed endlessly patient, endlessly understanding, endlessly available, one day just stops. They don't scream, they don't confront you, they don't post about you, they just remove you, quietly, permanently. And that silence does more damage than any argument ever could. If you've ever been called too sensitive, if you've ever stayed in situations long past the point you should have left, or if you've watched someone like this disappear from your life, this is going to explain exactly what happened inside their mind. And by the end, you're going to understand something that most people only learn after it's too late. There's a term behavioral psychologists use called hyperempathic processing. It describes how certain people's nervous systems are literally wired differently. Their mirror neurons, the part of the brain that simulates other people's experiences, fire at an intensity most brains don't reach. These aren't just sensitive people. They are people whose neurological baseline involves processing other people's emotional states as if they were their own. What that means in real life is this. When you're anxious in a room, they feel it. When you're hiding something, they sense the incongruence before your words confirm it. When you're performing happiness over pain, their body registers the gap. They don't just read people, they absorb them. And here's the part that makes this dangerous, not for others, but for themselves. Because when you're built to feel everything, the world is relentless. Every conversation costs energy. Every conflict leaves residue. Every betrayal doesn't just hurt, it gets stored, filed, cataloged, deep in a nervous system that never fully forgets how something felt. This is not weakness, this is a neurological reality. And understanding it is the key to understanding what happens when these people finally break. Think about someone you know, or maybe this is you, someone who always picked up the phone, who always listened longer than they needed to, who gave people the benefit of the doubt even when every signal said stop. They weren't naive, they saw the red flags, they felt the manipulation, they noticed the patterns. But something in them held on, because they genuinely believed they could understand someone into changing. That if they just gave enough patience, enough grace, enough time, the person would eventually show up as who they had the potential to be. That belief is one of the most beautifully human things a person can carry. It is also one of the most quietly destructive. Because here's what nobody teaches us about emotional capacity. It is not infinite. It looks infinite from the outside. It feels infinite to the person exercising it. But underneath that endless patience is a reservoir, and reservoirs have limits. The difference is that most people's limits come with warnings, arguments, outbursts, ultimatums. But hyper-empathic people, the ones wired to feel deeply, their limit doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives as silence. There are 4 psychological stages every deeply empathic person goes through before they reach that silence. And if you understand these stages, you'll understand why the outcome is almost always the same. The first stage is called absorption. This is when the empath takes in everything around them without filters. Every mood, every tension, every unspoken resentment. They don't mean to absorb it all, they simply can't stop it. Their nervous system doesn't have the same emotional firewall others take for granted. In this stage, they are most generous, most available, most forgiving. This is the version of them most people fall in love with. The second stage is called justification. This is where the psychology becomes fascinating and heartbreaking. When someone treats an empath poorly, the empath's first instinct is not anger, it's understanding. They ask, what happened to this person that makes them this way? They trace the behavior back to old wounds, to childhood, to patterns learned in pain. And because they can feel other people's pain so precisely, they extend compassion where most people would have walked away already. This is where toxic people gain the most access. Because nothing keeps a person closer than making them feel like they are the only one who truly understands you. There's a clinical pattern in psychology called trauma bonding. It occurs when emotional highs and lows are irregular. Moments of warmth followed by withdrawal, affirmation followed by criticism, closeness followed by abandonment. The unpredictability itself becomes addictive. The nervous system begins chasing the highs because the lows have become normalized. Empaths are disproportionately vulnerable to this cycle. Not because they're weak, but because their capacity for understanding literally exceeds most people's capacity to be understood. And some people exploit that, consciously or not. But eventually, and this is critical, the justification stage ends. Not with a dramatic realization, not with a shouting match. It ends quietly, in the middle of an ordinary moment. Someone says something thoughtless. Again. They dismiss the empath's feelings. Again. They show up only when they need something. Again. And something inside the empath shifts. Not breaks, shifts. Like a tectonic plate. Slow, invisible. And once it moves, it doesn't move back. This is stage 3, observation. Something fascinating happens neurologically in this stage. The empath's brain begins decoupling emotional response from intellectual assessment. Where before they felt first and thought second, they begin to think first and feel at a distance. They stop arguing because they've already concluded. They stop explaining because they've already understood. They stop reacting because they're no longer surprised. They begin watching the same behavior they once tried to fix, with almost clinical detachment. And that detachment is the beginning of the most powerful transformation a human being can go through. People who knew them notice something is different. The empath seems calmer, more composed. They smile and say, "I'm fine." And this time, somehow, it sounds true. But it's not contentment, it's distance. They are still in the room physically, but emotionally they have already begun to leave. And they are watching, noticing every pattern they once made excuses for, every manipulation they once called a misunderstanding, every red flag they once painted over with hope. The mask doesn't work anymore, and the empath stops pretending it does. This is where empaths become, in a psychological sense, genuinely powerful and genuinely difficult to control. Behavioral psychology research on high empathy individuals shows something counterintuitive. People with the highest levels of empathic accuracy, the ability to precisely read emotional states, can, when they choose to disengage, become extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Why? Because manipulation relies on emotional blind spots. It works by exploiting hope, guilt, fear, and the desire for connection. But someone who has fully mapped your emotional patterns, documented your inconsistencies, and detached from the outcome is immune to most of those tools. Guilt trips stop working. Silent treatment stops working. Intermittent warmth stops working. Because the empath's nervous system is no longer seeking resolution from that source. Think about what that means for a moment. The person you thought you had complete emotional leverage over, the person who used to apologize when you were wrong, who chased you when you pulled away, who kept showing up after you let them down, is now watching you with the same calm precision a researcher uses when studying behavior in a controlled environment. You didn't lose a person who needed you. You lost a person who saw you completely and chose to stop participating. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most total forms of rejection a human being can experience. Stage 4 is called liberation. This is the stage most people never see coming, and it's the one that changes the empath permanently. At some point, the empath stops grieving what they lost, not because they didn't care, but because they spent so much time grieving in private, in their car, at 2 a.m., in the middle of conversations nobody knew were tearing them apart, that by the time they physically distance, the grief is already complete. They already said goodbye. Alone. In the quiet places nobody else was invited into. So when the final separation comes, there are no tears, no final speech, no dramatic exit. There is just absence. Clean, quiet, total. And here is where people make the catastrophic mistake of underestimating the empath one final time. They think the absence is temporary. They think the empath will come back, like they always did. They wait for the message, the reaching out, the familiar pattern of the empath absorbing more, forgiving again, returning to the cycle. But the message doesn't come, Because the empath who has reached stage 4 has done something no amount of charm, guilt, or nostalgia can undo. They have rewritten the story they were telling about the relationship. And in the new story, the ending already happened. There is actually neuroscience behind this. Research on emotional processing and attachment shows that the human brain processes relational loss through the same neural pathways as physical pain, which means every time an empath was hurt and chose to stay, they were essentially choosing to keep their hand on a hot surface. Over time, the brain adapts. It numbs the pathway. It reduces the pain signal not because the situation improved, but because the nervous system decided that pathway was no longer worth protecting. This is called neural habituation. And in the context of toxic relationships, it creates something paradoxical. The more someone was hurt and stayed, the less emotional pain their eventual departure involves. They've already felt most of it. The leaving itself is almost peaceful. That's the part that breaks people's minds when they lose an empath. They expect devastation. They expect begging. They expect the version of the empath who stayed through everything. And instead they find someone who seems almost calm. Because they are calm. Not because they didn't love you, but because love, without reciprocity, without respect, without basic human decency, eventually exhausts itself. Not dramatically, not vindictively, just completely. Now here's the thing that most content about empaths misses entirely, and this is the part I really want you to sit with. The dangerous side of an empath is not what happens when they leave, it's what happens when they heal. Because a healed empath doesn't become cold, they don't become closed, they don't become a lesser version of themselves, they become extraordinarily precise. They carry everything they learned, every emotional pattern they observed, every manipulation tactic they endured, every red flag they finally allowed themselves to name, and they apply that understanding to every new interaction going forward. Think about what years of hyper-empathic processing combined with forced psychological survival produces in a human being. You have someone with near professional level skill at reading emotional states. Someone who is trained, by necessity, to detect inconsistency between what a person says and how their energy shifts. Someone who knows exactly what real care looks and feels like because they gave it unconditionally, and learned to recognize its absence. A healed empath walking into a room doesn't scan for threats out of anxiety. They scan because they're extraordinarily good at it, and they've decided their peace is the non-negotiable priority. That is not weakness rebuilt into strength. That is something entirely different. That is wisdom with a spine. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where psychological suffering produces lasting positive change, identify several consistent markers in people who have gone through exactly this kind of relational transformation. Increased sense of personal strength, deeper appreciation for authentic connection, a measurable reduction in tolerance for superficial relationships, and what researchers call revised life narrative, a rewritten internal story about who the person is and what they deserve. These are not soft outcomes. These are structural changes in how the brain processes identity and attachment. In other words, the empath who was repeatedly taken advantage of and finally chose themselves didn't just feel better, they fundamentally rewired. And you can see it in the way they move through the world after. They are warmer with people who deserve warmth and completely unreachable to people who don't. The difference between those two experiences, if you've ever known a healed empath, is staggering. One person feels like standing in sunlight. The other feels like standing outside in winter looking through a window. Not because the empath became cruel, but because they became honest. And their honesty no longer bends to accommodate comfort. So what does all of this mean for you? If there is someone in your life right now who shows up with patience, who listens longer than they have to, who forgives faster than seems reasonable, who absorbs tension without complaint, pay attention. Because what you're experiencing is not softness, it is restraint. It is someone who could articulate exactly how you made them feel and chooses grace instead. Every single time. Until they don't. And the distance between every single time and until they don't can close faster than you think. Quietly. without warning signs you'd recognize in time. Because the nature of stage 4, liberation, is that it often looks from the outside like nothing changed. The empath still smiles, they still engage, they are still kind. But there is a version of kindness that comes from abundance, from genuine warmth for another person. And there is a version of kindness that comes from completion, from having already decided. The first version keeps a door open. The second version is already gone. Learning to tell the difference matters, because once the second version arrives, no conversation, no apology, no dramatic gesture closes the distance. The door was never slammed. It was simply allowed to close, softly, permanently. There's something else worth naming here, something that sits beneath all of this and rarely gets said plainly. Most people in the lives of empaths didn't set out to cause damage. They weren't executing a calculated plan of emotional destruction. They were simply comfortable. Comfortable with the empath's patience. Comfortable with the forgiveness always arriving on schedule. Comfortable with the emotional labor being carried so reliably that they never had to learn to carry it themselves. Comfort is its own kind of cruelty when it's built on someone else's silence. The tragedy of most of these relationships is not malice, it is mutual unawareness. The empath unaware of their own limits, the other person unaware of the cost being paid, until the cost becomes total. And by then, both people are standing in the rubble of something that might have been preserved. If one person had been kinder, yes, but also if the other had been louder. If the empath had said, "This is hurting me," before reaching the point where the words stopped coming. This is one of the hardest truths about emotional intelligence. The very depth that allows someone to understand and absorb also makes them reluctant to burden others with their own experience. They have felt the weight of other people's pain so precisely, they don't want to add more pain to the world. So they carry, and carry, and carry, until they simply cannot. But here is what I want you to take from all of this, regardless of which side you've been on. The transformation an empath undergoes is not a loss of their truest self. It is the arrival of it. The version of them that existed before, absorbing, justifying, overextending, shrinking to fit into spaces they should never have been required to shrink inside, that was a survival mechanism. It was adaptive. It kept them connected in environments that didn't deserve their connection. What comes after, the precision, the selectivity, the quiet confidence, the ability to feel deeply and still protect themselves, that is not damage. That is development. And the people who are lucky enough to know an empath after this transformation experience something rare. They experience someone who chose to trust again, not because they forgot what it cost last